I'm actually on a walking desk. So why is Dan
The
moving so much?
walking
So I guess I'll go.
Hello and welcome everyone to Mindset Lab Season 2. This season we plan to bring new guests on to continue to have constructive conversations about the mental approach to coaching and sport, while also exploring tools for athletes of all ages. If you were with us at all last season, you would recognize award-winning author, educator, and co-host Dr. Jennifer Fraser with us today. Jen, how are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for asking, Jameson. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm sure we're both equally as excited to be joined today by Dr. Daniel Siegel, who is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and is also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Siegel.
Jameson, good to be here, Dr. Fraser. And you want to be called Jennifer, Jen, or Dr. Fraser?
Please call me Jen.
Okay, great.
And shall we call you Daniel or Dan or?
Dan is good unless you're mad at me. You can call me Daniel. My
Yeah, no,
mother's memory
isn't that?
cells will get activated.
Yeah, if you guys want to call me Dr. Schultz-Frank, no, I'm kidding. I haven't earned that at all.
When you do, we'll give you that name.
Thank you. Thank you. Personally, I've been learning a lot about your work, Dr. Siegel, and one of the areas of your focus that I've particularly been excited by is your work with education. And you talked about 3 R's, like reflection and relationships and resilience being introduced to education. And I mean, those 3 words are super important. And I'd love to hear more about how you think that can be implemented into education or organized activities like sport.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. We go through school, before we start doing sports, and we're learning the other first R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. And those require knowledge and learning of skills. And as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, what I found was that a lot of the children and teenagers I was seeing, they didn't get the opportunity to actually learn what they needed in life for a life skill, right? So whether they were, learning a musical instrument, or they were on a, athletic team, or they were, trying to work with other kids on a play they were doing, or whatever the non-academic thing was, they just weren't getting the skills. So it seemed to me, both as a professional and earlier when I was in medical school, and ultimately was really disillusioned with it, and I dropped out for a while, that the inner life was really, really important. And so later on, when I was working with kids in schools, I just said, hey, why don't we have these other 3 R's in addition to reading, writing, arithmetic? Those are important. But what if we taught kids to reflect on the inner world, this something you can call like the mind, your feelings and thoughts. And, so I use the word mindsight when I dropped out of medical school, just to give me a word when I went back that I could realize what my professors didn't seem to have, which was a big problem for their patients and for their students. So that was the reflection piece. And then the relationship part was, strangely, during the era of the decade of the brain, when I was leaving my training in psychiatry, relationships were actually not thought of as that important, as strange as that sounds. So I just decided to do research on, are relationships important, and if they are, how are they and why are they? So that second R was pretty clear. And then the third R, resilience, was the idea that you could build a skill of how to handle challenges where not only would you, survive, but you'd thrive. You might even grow through a very difficult experience. So whether that's in athletics and coaching, people in sport, or just in life, this becomes a really important way of living. It overlaps with, I think, what Carol Dweck might call a growth mindset, or, Angela Duckworth beautifully studies grit. Having mindsight is kind of, I think, in some ways at the heart of both those growth mindset approaches and grit. Not that they use that term, but when you look at the studies, it's someone who really has an awareness of their inner life. And even if you look at the studies of wisdom, people who are considered wise have not only an awareness of their own inner life, but they realized that to really bring happiness to yourself, you really need to be of service to the benefit of others. So that's, all about this word resilience. How do you actually approach life in these ways? Anyway, so I kind of like words. So those three R's just became a fun alliteration of, resilience, relationships, and reflection.
I'm thinking of your book, Brainstorm, and how you've done a lot of work and research and thought, and you've parented and you've worked with these many clients who are teenagers and up until sort of 23, 24, and their brains are in development. And yet, this information really is not reaching coaches, it's not really reaching teachers or parents. So, when you talk about this relationship between the adult brain and the adolescent brain, and how important it is for that. I was just wondering if you could share with our listeners more about what's happening in the adolescent brain that adults need to know, that coaches really need to know about in order to help them become the adults that they're on the path to become.
Oh, that's such a great question, Jen. I think in some ways it relates to Jameson's question too. It's these sort of build on each other. Do you guys ever think about working together? Um, uh, it's great. What I was taught by my teachers in training, I'd been in pediatrics originally and then moved over to psychiatry and then child and adolescent psychiatry, was really not fitting with my own experience with my own kids. And then you'd hear what our kids' parents would be saying, like, oh my God, the raging hormones are going to take over, which around the world, that's kind of what everyone says when you say, what's adolescence? They go, raging hormones. Well, that's actually a myth. It's wrong. Or they say, oh my God, it's a terrible period of life. Get through it as fast as possible. You should just freeze dries the kids. And then once, they're through their adolescence, just unfreeze them. And that's like the opposite of actually what the studies show. And then another thing is that, adolescents need to be totally independent of adults. Well, they shouldn't. They need to move away toward their peers and move away from their parents, but there need to be other adults who are trustworthy that they can have in their lives. Anyway, so those myths really were painful because I saw so many adolescents in my practice, in addition to my kids' friends and my kids, who were struggling during this period of time when no one really knew what was going on. So around that time, this is now about 15 years ago, we started learning things about the adolescent brain that we just didn't know before. And, it was a remarkable discovery here at UCLA by some colleagues, but also at the National Institute of Health. Their brains were being scanned before adolescence. Then they were followed regularly into adolescence. And then they could even take people later on who were older and try to compare their brains, and assuming they were similar. But the longitudinal study was to study groups of individuals over again. And they found that in the first dozen years of life, basically, the brain's basic cells, the neurons, are growing more and more connections with each other. Was what we kind of knew was happening. And my teacher of neuroscience, David Hubel, showed that, the kinds of experiences you have shape those interconnections among the neurons. And that's really cool. And that's great. But what happens around, it's not the same as puberty, but it's around the same time. The brain, instead of just continually absorbing new and new connections, getting more and more intricate, it starts to prune itself down. That is, just like if you're growing a garden, you got all these plants growing, you cut off some of the limbs so it creates the shape you want, or you allow the pathways to exist in the garden. You need to prune a garden or it's just going to be overwhelming. That's the same thing they started seeing in the adolescent brain. And unfortunately, what that means, though, is that, let's say, just for hypothetical reasons, let's say you're going to prune half of the connections you made away, including some of the neurons. Someone who might be vulnerable, who didn't show any kind of psychiatric problems in childhood, which is our period of dependency, and adulthood, let's say, is a period of responsibility. Adolescence as a period of time would be a period of basically learning how to move from dependency to responsibility. And it's not just a waiting period. It's a very important period that we can look at in a moment and why the brain's doing this, but it's pruning away to get rid of these neurons. So if you're at risk, you might actually prune away too many, and what's remaining for self-regulation is not enough. So some kids who are going to end up with a psychiatric disorder like depression or manic depressive illness, for example, or schizophrenia, they might actually be most likely to have its first onset during this period, not because of raging hormones, which don't exist. Hormones rise, they don't rage, and that changes the brain, of course. But what we think goes on is that the pruning, which is inevitable, exposes vulnerable children. So you just don't have enough of the regulatory circuits you need. And then in the second part of adolescence, you then lay down myelin, which is a connecting sheath, which says basically to those neurons and their connections that remain, let's make you even more effective and efficient and coordinated. And we can talk about the neurophysiology of that, but basically you're differentiating the brain in the first part of adolescence by pruning it, and then you're linking it up by making it more, taking the skills it maintained, it's a use it or lose it process, and then making the brain actually more what's called integrated. So it's a great, fantastic, wonderful process, which has certain features to it that are risky, but through that vulnerability, you actually gain growth. And the brain's becoming more integrated means it's going to be able to be more reflective, able to have more mutually rewarding relationships, able to be more resilient. That's what integration creates. So those outcomes are essential for living a vital life throughout your lifespan.
Yeah. A lot of the things that I'm hearing you say kind of remind me, well, neural integration is one thing that I am just beginning to learn about from your work. And it kind of reminds me of that, the separation that exists. I notice it exists a lot within sport, and I would say society, of that separation between like mind and body. And there's not a whole lot of like bridging between like what's your actual experience, and like how can you cater to young people talking about their actual experience in sport or in society. And I'm curious how you would approach a conversation with someone who is maybe not aware of what's going on in their brain to bridge the gap between mind and body. Is neural integration the way that you would approach that conversation, or?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I know our daughter was a volleyball player when she was in middle school and high school. And, this is when I was learning about all this stuff. And it was really fascinating to think about it, to talk to her coaches about it, and to actually talk to the parents of her friends, her teammates about these things. I don't think she knew I was doing all this talking to them, but I don't think she would have been too happy about that. But you're sitting there in the bleachers, like waiting and waiting, so you talk about stuff. Anyway, so I think the sport, in this case, volleyball, was such a fantastic opportunity to build on. There are four big changes that adolescence as a period of time involved. That I'm an acronym addict, and this is one acronym that's pretty easy to remember. It's the essence of adolescence. So there's an emotional spark, so if you compare like an 8-year-old to a 14-year-old to a, let's say, 34-year-old person, there's just more intense emotion in an adolescent. You know that when you go to dinner and you have a table full of adolescents and you have a table full of adults. Jameson, I'm not going to ask how old you are, but for those of us who are, past the adolescent period, you're hanging out with your adult friends. Everything is really kind of neutral pretty much. But at the adolescent table, they're laughing and they're crying and everything just a higher volume. And they're having a lot more fun, so you don't need to let go of that, but a lot of adults have. So that's the passion of the emotional spark. And there's a reason for each of these and a vulnerability, but you can see this passion on the volleyball court for sure. And, it's so exciting. And especially in volleyball, it's so interesting. You can't succeed unless you're a team, and everyone makes, quote, a mistake. And you have to, learn how to flush it and just move on. Because if you keep on being preoccupied with, oh my God, I hit it too hard, hit it too far, hit it not far enough, whatever, you can't do the next round, So it's a really fascinating game that way. And you need to take your passion and govern it well. The next one is social engagement, SE. And adolescents are driven to collaborate with their peers. And volleyball, it's all about collaboration, who you're setting up and who's, rotating in and out and all this stuff. I mean, there are politics to it too, which are, can be very agitating, but, because people are people, but at its best, it's this incredibly collaborative team experience. So that's SE. The novelty, novelty seeking is part of what the adolescent brain is driven to do. In addition to this passion and the collaboration, it's really has the courage. And so when you'd see our daughter's teammates come up with some novel ways of really wiping out the team they were playing, it was pretty exciting. And you had to have courage to try a setup in a different way. Someone's going there and someone else is going over there. And it was very exciting. And the final one, was creative explorations, which is really an imagination that as a team, they could, imagine, a way when they would watch the other team and see what the other team's strengths and vulnerabilities were. They could not only have the courage, the novelty, but they could imagine together creatively how they might, as a team, psych out the other team. And so it was more than just, physical skills. So their essence was tapped in, and our daughter did this for, I don't know, 6-7 years. And it was a really big part of her life. And it was beautiful to see the adolescence aspect of this essence really be tapped into. And I think coaches can learn about this. I think when you realize that the pruning and myelin formation that can be summarized with just the word remodeling, that this adolescent brain is remodeling. And if you remember this one simple little, I don't know what you call it, like a doodah or whatever, but it's where attention goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. And, I needed some kind of phrase in teaching parents and adolescents that the attention is the way you drive energy through your nervous system. And it's how you get certain connections to maintain themselves and even grow in the brain, whatever your age, but especially when an adolescent hears that their brain is pruning itself down. For a lot of the kids I teach at school, they freak out, And so you say, but hold on, you're in charge. If you want to spend 7 hours a day, just moving a mouse around, you're going to have a big part of your brain controlling your right hand that's going to really be well developed. Go for it, but it's your choice. And, like our daughter played volleyball and did a lot of, art and stuff. Our son was a musician. He's older than she is, but he would be playing guitar 7-8 hours a day. And, now he's a professional musician, Alex Siegel. You can listen to him on Spotify, but you can see that the instrument became like a part of his body. Why? Because where attention goes, he was focusing on the music, neural firing flows, he got his brain activated, and neural connection grows. So his brain is different than a kid who be just doing video games all day long, So adolescence is this cool and fantastic period. And if we as adults can hold on to our essence, we actually can keep our brains integrated and growing well throughout the lifespan. So, the essence is so useful, I think, for coaching because it just is easy to remember. And it's just based on the cutting edge science about the adolescent developmental period.
I can't get over how important this message is and how much this knowledge and research and the understanding that you have over the span of your work and your frustration with medical school, because while medical school might have changed and while you've done a very innovative work in your whole series of your books, it's really not trickling down. So in sport, and this is why Jameson and I became really interested in collaborating together, we wanted to look at coaches who they've been trained in a model. So they have, I would argue, they have very entrenched neural networks. And so they believe that this is the way to, they still believe in the raging hormones and they think that they must be the focus of the athlete. So they're screaming at the athlete, they're berating the athlete. They're not letting this kind of creative expression or this freedom to play. And it's out of good-heartedness. They truly believe from their own training, their own success, that if they could just get the adolescent brain to kind of be dismantled, then their great power is to reassemble it almost in an image of themselves. And so you get this abusive coaching model that's happening over and over and over again. And this is why Jameson and I wanted to kind of have a big conversation about it. So I think it would be really powerful for our athletic listeners, administrators and coaches and athletes to hear you talk about demeaning versus demanding. Do we make athletes resilient and have grit and toughness by humiliating them and berating them and threatening them? There's a lot of athletic programs that believe that, and they condone it and normalize it. And athletes, they don't know any better. What would you say as a brain expert about that?
Wow. Well, Jen, that's a fabulous question. Wow, there's so many things going through my mind. The brain has these two basic states it can get into, and the word state simply means kind of a set of networks that are active in a given moment of time. And the brain is designed to have different states. If you walk along the beach with your romantic partner, you're going to be in one state, and if someone grabs your shoulder to steal your wallet, you're going to quickly enter a different state, right? So it's meant to have these states, but two of the basic states to always think about, I think, whether you're a coach or a parent or just a person on the planet, is, are you in a receptive state or are you in a reactive state? And those are extremely different in the networks that they recruit. So let's talk about each of those states. The receptive state is a state where someone feels respected. They feel maybe they're being asked to do something, but they're asked to do it with a lot of dignity and integrity, and there's a sense that maybe I won't succeed, but at least I'll be trying my best. And if I don't succeed, the person, let's say my coach, my parent, who's interacting with me will understand I did my best, right? So a receptive state like that turns on what a wonderful researcher named Steve Porges calls the social engagement system. And when you look at Steve's fantastic work, in the brain, you basically widen your perception. You see more. You want to connect to other people more. So if you're a teammate, that's really good. You're able to recruit more resources inside of you. So that's all the receptive state. Tina Payne Bryson, my co-author, and I wrote a book called The Yes Brain, all about, for younger kids at least, how to create this kind of receptive state in parenting, because a lot of parents think the word discipline means to punish. And if a coach, for example, takes that misunderstanding of the word discipline and thinks I'm going to discipline my team members, my athletes, then what they may do, even if it has good intentions, it'll have bad outcomes, because even if they win the game, they're going to lose the player, because what they do is they're thinking of discipline as punishment, rather than discipline really means to teach. And if you can convey a learning message to an athlete, they carry that message with them in a receptive state. But if you're trying to punish them, they're going to enter the reactive state. And the reactive state has four kind of branches that, when you study the brain, you can show how these get activated. One is fighting. And a coach may say, yeah, but I want my players to fight. And we know from research that in reactive states, you just don't think as clearly. You're trying your best to survive. And sometimes, because of something called top-down thinking, other options to you wouldn't consider, because you've entered one of these four states. What are those four states? You're fighting. So rather than backing off and just saying, let me be flexibly think about all my options here, and be careful about when I lose options. So when you're fighting, you're just out fighting something. Or fleeing, that's the second state of reactivity. You flee and you're just running like mad. Or the third state is freezing. And freezing is where you're tightening up your muscles and you don't know essentially whether to fight or flee. So you're just temporarily paralyzing yourself. And then the fourth F, which a lot of people don't realize is there, but it's fainting, where you collapse. A lot of people will put together freeze and faint as if it's the same thing. They're actually extremely different. Freeze is literally energy consuming and you just don't know what to do. Oh my God, oh my God. But a faint is a collapse. Literally, your blood pressure drops, your heart rate drops, and you faint. Or you feign death, is another F way of interpreting that. So when we're in a reactive state, if you get an athlete in a reactive state, they're actually not going to be as flexible as someone who can stay in a receptive state. And I'm thinking now about a volleyball player or football player, where you can be trying to win the game, but you don't feel like someone's going to, really demean you because you don't throw the ball well. You're in a receptive state, you get in the zone, and you just hurl that football to your receiver, and your receiver catches it, and you get a touchdown, not because you were reactive, but because you were receptive. So you can be competitive and engaged and disciplined without being demeaned, right? And and you use the word demanding. I guess it's fun with the D's, but I think when demanding, you mean, do you have high expectations, right? Is you're right. And there's a quote, and I can't remember who said it. I said in the beginning of Brainstorm, we'll have to think about who the name of the person was, but it's something like, people will rise to the lowest level of our expectations. So if you really don't expect much of people, they won't do much. But if you actually see the possibilities in people, they're more likely to be able to achieve those possibilities. And that's what a receptive state is. I know my coach believes in me. My coach she's taught me stuff. He's taught me stuff. I'm going to bring out the best of myself. That's a receptive state, and you're flexible. And so that's my response, Jen, to that question. And I understand that a lot of coaches themselves had stuff happen to them, so they kind of go on automatic pilot. And sometimes it's an absolute disaster. A friend of mine made a film about a coach, in called Happy Valley, about what happened at Penn State. And sometimes coaches can do disastrous things, so we want to be careful of not having reflection as a coach. And I'm not saying people are abusive, all the time, but that's just one extreme example of someone who is so unaware of the impact of his actions on young people. And we have huge impacts as teachers, as therapists, as coaches. And so to take a moment and really say, well, what happened to me? Oh my God, I was yelled at and demeaned. Maybe that's not such a good thing. That takes a lot of strength and wisdom and courage. And we need to applaud and support coaches who do that, because it's more often than people, parents is the same thing true too. People are just on automatic pilot and they just repeat what happened to them.
My brain's firing on all cylinders right now, thinking, just hearing what you're saying. Like I think about this receptive state that you're talking about, and how you're able to see more and really bring more out of your players as well as a coach. And as coach and as you said, in teachers, I think one of your quotes was saying, how is it possible to have really smart professors who are blind to the mind? And I'm kind of curious how you even form that. Like is it because that's what happened to you, or how do you like really approach that with people who are blind to the mind, or educators who are blind to the mind?
Yeah. Well, Jameson, it's such an interesting question. I was so baffled as to what happened to me. I had to write a whole book called Mind, just to summarize what Jameson's referring to. I went to college and, studied biochemistry and did well as a college student. So I got into a fancy medical school, right? I went to Harvard for medical school. And yet when I was at Harvard, I was so excited to be there. I was the youngest student there, and I was way too young to be there. But anyway, I found working with patients so rewarding, and working with the professors so distorting, that I became really depressed and confused. Like, what's going on here? And then I just came to realize that I just didn't want to become like them. I couldn't even name exactly what it was. It just was in my body. There was like this feeling, like in my heart, something felt wrong. In my gut, something really felt wrong. Even though in my head, since I was trained as a scientist, it was actually pretty easy to do the academic work. My head would say, what's wrong with you? The inner voice would say, what's wrong with you? You're at Harvard Medical School. You should stay there, blah, blah, blah. And I went into the dean, and I just found out she's still alive. She's 102, Dean Carola Eisenberg. 102, can you imagine? So I go to the dean and I say, I'm going to drop out of school. She goes, why? Your grades are excellent. You know, I was getting top marks, you know, in my class and all this stuff. I said, it's not the grades. There's just, I don't even know. I can't stand being here. There's something wrong. All I can say is it's wrong. I don't even know what that means. She goes, well, why don't you take a leave of absence? I said, because I'm never coming back to this nut house, you know? And she said, well, how do you know what you're going to do? You know, you're only whatever I was, 22 or something like that. You know, she said, how do you know what you do? And I said, well, you're right. I don't know that's my point. I don't know what I'm going to do. She goes, well, then take a leave of absence. I said, no, I'm never coming back. She goes, how do you know? We went round and round. So finally I said, okay, I'll take a leave of absence. She goes, okay, now you have to write your essay. I said, what kind of essay? She goes, well, this is a research medical school. You don't just take a leave of absence. You know, you're not dropping out, you're taking a leave. She goes, you have to do research. I go, oh, you're tricking me. She goes, no, write an essay. So I said, okay, give me a piece of paper. And I wrote a 1-sentence essay. I said, I am going to take a leave of absence to figure out who I am. And I put a period by it. I handed it to her. She looked at it. She goes, that's perfect. So I left. And the wonderful Noreen Kohler, the wonderful registrar who refused to let computers into that registrar's office, she said if they brought computers, she'd quit. So when I'm, you know, signing off my papers for my leave of absence, she looks at me in the eye, right, person to person. She goes, Daniel, there's the Daniel thing. She goes, do me a favor. Do not come back to this institution unless you want to be here. And I looked her in the eye and there was this silence. So I said, okay, I promise you that. So I took off. I did all sorts of wild things. I thought about being a dancer and a choreographer and all sorts of stuff. And then unfortunately, John Lennon was assassinated. This was 1980. And I realized the mind could be so disturbed that it could get someone to kill John Lennon, right? Because the person who killed him thought he himself was John Lennon. So he had to kill the imposter. And then all sorts of other stuff was happening. My grandfather was dying. And I started realizing that what was wrong in medical school was that those professors acted like there was no such thing as the mind. Like feelings didn't exist or thoughts didn't exist. Like they were super smart and devoted, caring, you know, physicians, but they never looked at a person's emotions or motivations. Or I remember saying to people like, you know, let's figure out the meaning of this illness in a person's life, or what about their relationships that support them or don't, or, you know, what's their narrative? Who are they? What's the story of this person's life? Anyway, so I made up this word mindsight when I went back. And to get to your point, you know, I think it was the despair and really the demoralization and the depression of being in that socialization process where you had really bright people who acted as if the only thing that existed was the objective world of measurable things like enzymes, or, you know, your labs, or taking a, you know, x-ray of the body or something. And so I just became devoted at that point. I was still an adolescent, to use, now I would say it was my essence, use the passion I had to really connect with people, you know, the collaboration to really work with people. You know, I guess I wouldn't have said it back then, but now when I look back at myself, I would say it was a kind of courage to try something new. And then everything I did since then was to take the word mindsight and see how it applied in different settings. So in medical school, you know, I saw how it worked. In pediatrics, I saw that. And then strangely enough, the same thing worked in psychiatry. You know, in the 80s, it was like, you know, everything's going to be about the brain and genetics. And so we're just going to be, you know, fancy neurologists. And, you know, the question was Hippocrates right? Was the mind just brain activity? That's what Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago. So I started questioning all that stuff, and I thought the mind was broader than the brain, you know, and even bigger than the body. And so in the last 30 years, always in this little room here, you know, all these books I write, you know, are, you know, really trying to say mind is really important, and mind is not a synonym for brain activity. It includes it, but it's much bigger than that. And that's a whole nother talk we can get into. But when you would come, let's say, to coaching adolescents, your relationship as a coach to the adolescent is a part of what the adolescent's mind is, because the mind is as much relational as fully embodied, you know, and that takes a little while to grasp that. you know, and so I try in different ways in these different books to make it accessible for people. But it's really, it changes everything. For example, it helps you approach the pandemic in a different way, to understand why sadly so many adolescents are ending their lives, because relationships are their lives. And you know, the social isolation with the physical distancing. And by the way, I think we should get rid of the term social distancing. It should be called physical distancing and maintaining social connection, because even the name kind of gives you the chills. You know, so you can see the pandemic as that, social injustice. You can see this way, even environmental destruction. I don't know where you are, Jameson, but is that a virtual thing or is that an actual forest behind you?
I'm actually here on Vancouver Island, which I understand you're pretty familiar with the area.
Oh, not only familiar with it, it's like my favorite place in the world. What part of Vancouver Island are you in?
I'm on Gabriel Island right now.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, no, that's great. You know, when I dropped out of school, I went to Vancouver Island. I don't know if you know that.
Yes, we do.
Oh, you do. And I
That's why
wound
we
my way.
Yeah, when you said that you dropped out of Harvard and had a wild time, we were like, that's British Columbia. Yeah.
Totally. Well, I took the train across Canada, and then I wouldn't tell my kids this now, but I hitchhiked, you know, through Vancouver Island all the way out to, I guess, what is it, Tofino?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I was on Long Beach, and yeah, it was an amazing time.
It's incredible.
Well, I'm a little bit conscious of the time. I know that we can't keep you forever, much as we want to. And I just want to end on a really practical note for our listeners,
Yeah.
which is that your understanding of Mindsight. I know that listeners are saying to themselves, I want that. I want to know, you know, I don't have time. I can't sit down and read all these incredible neuroscientific books, but how can I get Mindsight? And so I was hoping you could end off on talking about the mindful brain, which is the title of one of your books, because I know that you use mindfulness, and it's an interesting and poignant tie-in with Kobe Bryant, who was trained by George Mumford to become the brilliant athlete that he was because he was mindful. And there's lots of athletes and coaches that think they don't have time. They don't think they can be tough if they're mindful. They see mindful as almost a spiritual exercise. And I was hoping you could talk about how mindfulness actually gives you that breadth of vision, that creative mind, that opening, that social brain, that just incredible gift that comes with mindfulness practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Yeah, I was on a panel recently with George Mumford, actually run by someone who lives on Vancouver Island. So it's all a little small circle there. And on the panel, we talked exactly about this issue. And George was just fantastic. And, you know, the word mindfulness is very interesting because for some people, it evokes, Jen, just what you're saying, you know, like, oh, it's so spiritual. And, you know, I'm not a spiritual person. So what is it about? And, you know, for me, the way that word entered my life was not related to meditation or anything that you might call spiritual. It was my daughter's preschool director and I were trying to write a book called Parenting from the Inside Out. And we just said parents should be like conscientious and conscious and like intentional and caring and, you know, God, that's too many words. What isn't there one word that summarizes all that? So we said, yeah, it's like being mindful. Oh my God, that's a fun word. We put being mindful. So when the book came out, parents would look at the word where we said one of the principles of wonderful parenting, you know, whatever, parenting from the inside out, is to be mindful. And they said, when are you going to teach us to meditate? And Mary Hartzell and I, neither of us were meditators at the time. And so we said, what? And they said, yeah, I mean, you said meditation is like the most important thing a parent can do. We said, what book are you reading? And they said, your book here, Parenting from the Inside Out. Look, it says be mindful. I said, yeah, that means be conscientious, conscious, caring, intentional. They go, no, it means being a meditator. I said, well, what kind of meditation are you talking about? They go, what? Mindfulness meditation. I said, what's that? You know, no, it had been around for 2,500, 2,600 years at that time. So it's like, I was like so out of it. You know, I was already like pushing the boundaries in academia because I was saying mind is not just brain, that the last thing I wanted to do was be associated with some fringe, you know, strange thing like meditation. You know, this is now we're talking about 2003. And So right after that, I got put on a panel with a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who had translated Buddhist meditation training into secular meditation training in something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. And John and I were on this panel, and I said, look, I don't know anything about meditation, but it's strange the outcomes for sitting on a cushion and doing this thing, which I don't really understand, mindfulness meditation. When I look at the research you and Richard Davidson had done at University of Wisconsin, the outcomes are almost identical to what I study, which is parent-child relationships, where people are receptive instead of reactive, and they're promoting integration in the brain, by being tuned in and caring and loving of their child, right? And John looks at me, he goes, well, all these things you mentioned, I mentioned a lot of them in detail, the outcomes of secure attachment. He goes, those are not only the outcomes for mindfulness meditation, but they are what being mindful really means, like being flexible and reflective and resilient and all that stuff. So he sent me to go learn to meditate. And that's when I wrote the book, The Mindful Brain, because I was like a newcomer to the whole thing. And I'm not spiritually oriented, or I would never have said that about myself. So for those of you who are saying, I don't do spiritual things, I found basically what the word mindfulness means is an open awareness, period. And in that open awareness, you're entering that receptive state we talked about. Instead of being reactive, you have this open state. And, I was trying to describe it to my mom, who was trying to learn how to be more resilient in her life. Now she's 91. And she said to me just the other day, she goes, yeah, I do that COAL thing. You're talking about this. So it's this acronym. You're curious, you're open, accepting, and loving. And she goes, what I realize about COAL and being mindful is it allows you to transform what used to annoy you, now amuses you. And I said, that's got to be the best definition of mindfulness I've ever heard. Instead of getting annoyed, you get amused. And it gives you this incredible, in terms of those R's we started with, Jen, it gives you this resilience, which is what the research shows. It allows your relationships to be mutually rewarding. And it allows you to have, basically, part of Mindsight is this ability to have this curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love, this integrative state of insight and empathy and basically compassion and kindness. So if people say, oh, I want to learn Mindsight, we have in the Brainstorm book, the gray pages, which are all, these established Mindsight exercises. So even if you just get the Brainstorm book, you don't have to read the white pages, but look at the gray pages, which are very few in number. If you just start from the beginning all the way to the end, I don't think there's more than 40 of them, 40 pages, you will actually learn practices that build Mindsight. And as they do, they're also building the 3 pillars of what some people call mind training. Some people say it's simply the training of focused attention and the training of opening of awareness, those 2 things. Other people, in addition to those 2, would add a third, which is to train kindness. But half of the researchers said, no, kindness is its own training. Let's not call that mindfulness. So I just made up this phrase, 3-pillar mind training, and everyone was happy with that. So 3-pillar mind training is what you do in the Brainstorm book, where you're learning, and if you get the book Aware, it'll teach you step by step how to do this. You can do this thing called the wheel of awareness, which is this basically a way of integrating consciousness. So you differentiate in the hub of this wheel the open awareness of consciousness from elements on the rim, which are all the things you can be aware of. And then, like what you hear, what you see, what you smell, taste, and touch on the first segment, for example, you move this spoke of attention around. So you're differentiating the knowns on the rim from the knowing in the hub. And when you do it, it's kind of remarkable because you get all 3 pillars in one practice. And then in addition, you get this incredible reflective ability to be able to, let's say something's bothering you, you can sense that thing that's bothering you as a point on the rim, and you tap into the resource of the hub, which when you look at the science I talk about in Mind or Aware, you know, and I wanted to put this in Brainstorm, but my publisher said it's just too in depth to talk about the science of what consciousness is for adolescents. They're just trying to make it through adolescents. Don't do it. So we didn't put it in there. But they could read Aware, you know, which is the next book. And what you can see in this notion is that inside of us, and I think poets have talked about this forever, inside of us is a resource we sometimes can't access, but you can develop the Mindsight skill of tapping in through insight into this well, basically, of three things. It's this feeling of open awareness, some people call presence. It's this feeling I'm connected to everything. I'm connected to Jen, I'm connected to Jameson, I'm connected to the forest. You know, I'm connected across time. I remember walking near that forest right there, you know, when I was in my early 20s, when I was an adolescent. I can feel, you know, not just the connection to people on the planet and this awareness, but I feel love. And I've done this now with 50,000 people in person. I recorded the first 10,000. And you'll see this in the book Aware, the summary of the data. And in the survey, what's remarkable is how many people say when they just bend that spoke around and go right into the hub, they tap into this feeling of, yes, awareness, that's what it is, but this feeling of connection to everything and to love. And love, even though I'm a scientist, I'm not supposed to talk like this, love seems like from the survey, it's a vital force of life that poets have talked about forever. Maybe regular human beings that aren't trained out of us as scientists, you know that. But for me as a scientist to start now writing a lot about love, I'll just give you one very, very brief story. I was asked to go to another country in the parliament and do the Wheel of Awareness practice. And during the break, after people had done the sharing, one of the most vocal of the people who didn't share at all during the sharing time came to me while we were having snacks. And he said, "Can I talk to you about why I didn't share during the sharing time?" I said, "Sure." And we go to the side in a private little corner of the room. And he goes, "You know that part when you bend the spoke around into the hub?" I said, yeah, I know that part. He goes, now he gets very teary. And he says, I have never in my life ever felt so much love before in my life. So much love. And I was connected to everyone and everything. And now he's crying. And there's a silence between the two of us. And I said, so you didn't want to share that with the group? He goes, oh, no. And he points over to his colleagues over in the other corner. And he goes, they would think I was weak. And then there's a silence between the two of us. I said, so you didn't want to look weak? He goes, oh, no. So then there's silence again. Then I said to him, can I ask you a question? He goes, yeah. And I said, when you're making federal law, when you're coming up with national policy for your whole country, are you leaving love out of the reasoning? And then there's silence, and his eyes get really, really big. His finger starts wagging at me. He goes, and he runs over and starts talking to his colleagues. I don't know what they said because I didn't go over there with him. But it was an amazing moment to think that from a scientific point of view, if we are so busy on the rim and don't tap into the source of love, and if love is scientifically established, just to give it, this solid credibility, if love is in fact like one of the singular threads of life that are a vital force we need that drives us to connect and bring justice into the world, then, I think it's important we just name it so that people, like, let's say you're a coach listening to this, people can say, I've got a coach with love. And I don't mean, this is where it gets tricky as a therapist. People sometimes hear love and they think you mean, sexual attraction and sexual activity. And that's the sad part about English, is that we have this one word love overlapping for making love sexually and the vital force of life. So we need to try to think how to clarify that. And still tapping into that is vital. So you coach from a place of mindfulness, which is curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love. It's this kind regard. It's a positive state. It's a vital force of life. It's what drives compassion and kindness, and so to leave it out as this parliamentarian was reflecting on that, is probably not a good idea in our world. And it's what the world needs now more than ever to preserve our relationships with each other as a people, to maintain our connections during pandemics, and to maintain our relationship with nature. If young people, if all people don't love nature, there'll be no reason to preserve it. And so love is it's essential for all of us. So I guess that's what I would say about the mindful brain. I over the years, I have come to really deeply appreciate, because I was just starting that survey stuff when I wrote The Mindful Brain. And now, years later, it's even more vital that I think we tap into this mindful way of being with each other and with our wonderful planet, our planet Earth.
Now, 3 fast concluding things, and then Jameson, I'll let you wind up. First of all, when you were talking about what your mother says, where annoyance becomes amusing, I instantly see an image of the Buddha who's laughing. He's laughing, he's joyful, and it's because he's so amused and so not annoyed. That's one thing.
Yeah, nice.
The classic coach for Inside Out, that's in fact the phrase he uses, Inside Out coaching, is Joe Ehrman, who's a former professional football player at the highest level and is considered one of America's greatest coaches. And he says to his boys, "What is your job?" And they say, "To love one another." And he says to them, "What is my job?" And they say, "To love us." And that's how they begin their practices and how they coach. And then just finally, George Mumford, the hub, he calls the hub the still small voice within, the voice of knowing. And I hear him when you use that. I love that. The hub and the wheel it's a brilliant way to train people mindfulness. And I agree. I know Brainstorm inside and out, and those pages that are in the gray for any athlete or any coach who thinks they're too busy, that is a life-saving, life-changing part of the book. And you can just apply it in your life instantly. So I want to personally, before I let Jameson finish us off, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today and your courage.
Oh, my pleasure, Jen. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do. And good luck to both of you and all your projects going on. Very exciting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and learn from the things that you're saying 110%.
Thanks for having me. And for everyone who didn't realize it, I'm actually on a walking desk.
I forgot to tell us about the walking desk.